domain, and our speaker today is Jamie Love, and I'm glad to say that his talk here is also co-sponsored by the Genome Ethics Law and Policy Center, which is part of Duke's IGSP, the Institute for Genome Science and Policy. This talk today is part of a series of activities that are going on at Duke and the law school, in particular the Center for the Study of the Public Domain, focusing on what you might think of as alternatives and additions and supplements to the intellectual property system. By that, what I mean is an exploration of ways of stimulating innovation that are outside the traditional intellectual property system or rely on changes in the traditional intellectual property system, or ways of using the existing intellectual property system in new ways, in ways of enabling creativity that haven't perhaps been tried before or as much. And we are going to be sponsoring a whole set of events over the course of the coming academic year that I think revolve around this kind of loose theme. So, for example, today Jamie's going to talk, and I'll tell you a little bit about his presentation. At a later point, we're also going to be supporting a meeting on open source drug discovery, which is an attempt to apply some of the techniques of open source software to drug discovery. And we have a project there which R.D. Rai is running, which is working in collaboration with the Genome Ethics Law and Policy Center here, working on that. Our colleague Anthony So, who's a senior fellow at the center and is joining us today, is working on a very interesting project about technology trusts, trying to deal with some of the difficulties that patent thickets, clusters of patents that have to be cleared in order to enable some new innovation, the obstacles that this poses to some modes of innovation. Our colleague Jerry Reichman is working on some very innovative proposals on liability rules and the way in which those can be used in order to facilitate innovation worldwide. And I am helping to produce a project on the so-called Science Commons. And David Lang has been working on a series of very interesting proposals about changes to the way in which we conceive of fair use and also the First Amendment with regard to copyright. Our goal in these sort of loosely organized or loosely clustered set of talks or events or meetings is to open up a debate about what intellectual property can do and what it can't do, and what changes need to be made to it in order to do what it can better than it's currently is doing it. The most ambitious of all of those is the one we start with tonight, which is Jamie Love's proposal for a research and development treaty, which would essentially offer, and I'll let him characterize it himself, but an opt-out strategy which would allow people, instead of using the intellectual property system to stimulate innovation for medicines, instead to in other ways put money into R&D, allow countries to put money into R&D through alternative methods of financing innovation, for example, through prizes that are offered, for example, for the first person to come up with a malaria vaccine or something of the kind. These are being portrayed, these kinds of proposals now, whether it's the open source drug discovery or this idea of Jamie's, are being described by their critics as extraordinarily radical proposals, which are challenging the norms of intellectual property policy. But I think that characterization is wrong on two grounds. First of all, it's wrong because even those who think that the intellectual property system works brilliantly and needs no change of any kind would have to acknowledge that there are certain things that our current IP system will never do. For example, if you have a patent-driven system of drug discovery, you rely on patent incentives in order to provide the pull to generate new drugs. You are never going to develop drugs that deal with the diseases of the global poor. You're not going to deal adequately with malaria, with leishmaniasis, and so forth, because the people who suffer from those diseases simply don't have enough money to provide the anticipatory market which would make a pharmaceutical company say, this is worth investing in order to develop a new drug. This is not a criticism of pharmaceutical companies, and it's not a criticism of the patent system per se. The patent system is working just as it's defined, and the pharmaceutical companies are being rational within it. The point is the system's never going to work. You have to think about an alternative or a supplement if you want to solve that problem. It's simply not an option to say, well, maybe patents will give us this. They won't. So that's one way in which I think it's a mistake to say that this relies on a full-blown attack on intellectual property and that it's radical and new. The other way is that I'm a fan of history, and sadly history gets lost in these debates about intellectual property. But I just wanted to read you a couple of things, and then I'll introduce Jamie and turn it over to him. Read you a couple of things that demonstrate that maybe some of these proposals aren't quite as either as radical or as new as perhaps we think. The first is from the British Parliament in 1714. The discovery of the longitude is of such consequence to Great Britain for the safety of the navy and merchant ships, as well as for the improvement of trade, that for want thereof many ships have been retarded in their voyages and many lost. As a result, Parliament in 1714 offers a prize of £20,000, which was an extraordinary amount of money in that time, in order to develop a mechanism for accurately determining longitude on the high seas, with the idea that this would then be distributed more or less at cost to the people who would use it in Britain's merchant fleet. Those of you who have read Davis Sobel's book Longitude know of the story. Here's another line. This is going to sound very like Jamie, and you're going to think that it's perhaps taken from his speech, but it's not. This is a violent criticism of patents, actually probably more violent than the one Jamie was going to offer tonight. What the community requires is that inventors be rewarded, that skillful men who contribute to the progress of society shall be well paid for their exertions. The patent laws are supported because it is erroneously supposed they are means to this end. And further, all that the opponents of the patent system say is that the present machinery gives the minimum advantage to the inventor and inflicts the maximum disadvantage to the public. Who's saying this? Karl Marx? No, it's The Economist. The Economist. You know the magazine The Economist? But writing in 1868, in the same issue, The Economist said it's obvious that the patent system will soon be abolished. They were wrong about that one. At the time, this is in the 1860s, all over Europe, people were criticizing, mainly economists, were criticizing the patent system as deeply flawed and arguing that alternatives needed to be developed, which would encourage incentives for innovation, but without the downside of patents. And let me read the list of alternatives, because again, I think it serves to suggest how we have returned in 2004 to a history that's kind of been forgotten. The most commonly recommended ones were that bonuses granted to inventors by the government, so I would pay you if you developed the malaria drug. Professional associations financed through voluntary contributions by private industries might pool technologies. Intergovernmental agencies might directly fund it, or an international association maintained through contributions from industries of all countries might contribute to a central fund which would encourage innovation. Mm-hmm. That was state-of-the-art thinking about alternatives and innovations, alternatives and additions to the patent system as of 1868. Sadly, we haven't really done much with the idea of alternatives and supplements to the patent system since that time, and I think one of the fascinating things about Jamie's very provocative proposal, one that he initially developed with Tim Hubbard and has subsequently developed with a lot of other people, is that it reopens that debate in a really blue sky way, in a very broad thinking and far-reaching way. Let me now turn to why I'm so happy to have Jamie here himself. Jamie's a longtime friend of mine. He is, in my view, the single most influential activist on intellectual property issues worldwide, and it's not even close. That is to say, he has done more issues on more, he's worked on more issues in more efficacious ways than anyone else that I know of. He's a person who is by training a professional economist, and he's also a brilliant politician in terms of the way that he perceives problems. When the database proposal was first put forward in the WIPO treaties of 1996, the rest of us were running around like chickens with our heads cut off going, this will destroy science, this is going to lock up facts, this is going to be terrible. Jamie looked at the problem for a long time and said, this would commoditize baseball box scores. You would be unable to get access to the box scores because the new database right would cover those. That, more than anything else, in my view, killed the database proposal in the United States, where the death of the American science and innovation system, shortly followed by American medicine, was of trifling concern. The possible loss of baseball box scores managed to pull it out. Jamie works with the Consumer Project on Technology. He's its director. He's also the co-chair of the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue, and he's on the Médecins Sans Frontières working group on intellectual property issues. He's advised governments, NGOs, and non-profits on IP issues. And we're just delighted to welcome him here tonight to kick off our series. Jamie Love, thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's see if I can figure out how to Get things going here. Can you hear me okay without this microphone? I think I'm wearing one of my neckties, so that's okay. I'm glad to be here today. I'm going to talk about this project that I'm involved in right now that started about 2 years ago, and I'll give you a short background on the basic idea of this, and then I'm going to walk you through the proposal. I will say, our biggest problem in describing this is there's too many different ideas in the same thing, and sometimes it gets a little confusing. Now, sort of one idea we have is that there needs to be a new trade framework for thinking about R&D. The current trade framework, as you know, is really the hard parts of it are the WTO agreement having to do with patents and other types of intellectual property, the TRIPS agreement, and then there's a lot of regional and bilateral agreements that extend that even further. And so because we're very unhappy with some features of that, we've thought it would be good to think about an alternative framework that actually did not have so much negative effects on access to medicine. There's a separate sort of thinking is if you had a more flexible framework for research and development at the international level, what would be the optimal strategy for a country to follow to implement these new obligations, because they would be different than the current obligations. And within that, we have sort of strived for a model that was quite flexible in implementation and would allow people to experiment with patent and non-patent models and to implement patents in a variety of different ways, but also to have a lot of non-patent things. And the U.S., of course, spending $28 billion a year on the NIH and more on other programs. I mean, we do that right now. I mean, we're not just about patents in the United States. We're about public sector financing, tax credits, philanthropy, a lot of different things too. So I think because we question sort of patents as being the be-all and end-all as the trade framework, sometimes that's interpreted a bit stronger than we like about our feeling about the possible role of patents. Because I think that we believe, and I think Jamie told me once, that each system of financing innovation has its strengths and its weaknesses, and sometimes it's not a good idea to go to the corner solution, to pick just one. And sometimes you might want to sort of use combinations of different mechanisms, but not. And so part of the problem we have in the trade framework, it's a corner solution. It relies only on strong intellectual property protections, basically, is the fundamental framework. So with that, just statement, I just want to sort of begin to sort of talk about this now. Skip over this one here. I've worked for a long time on a campaign for access to medicine in developing countries. And the main feature of that campaign is to have weak intellectual property rules. Either no patents or compulsory licenses on patents or whatever, just to bring the prices down and to have more competition. I mean, there's a very complicated explanation, but that's at the bottom line. That's what that campaign's about. Meanwhile, in science, there's been this big interest in sort of open source projects in the science area, influenced by the software experience. And so when there was this debate over the Human Genome Project, being private or public, and there was a big push to make it public, Aventis, which is a big pharma company, was looking at these different things going on, the open source software thing, the open source medicine, the access to medicine campaign. And so they were asking themselves at very senior levels, and they're also observing other problems in the pharma sector, like low productivity in R&D, resistance among European finance ministers in paying higher prices, things like that. They're wondering, what does the future of our industry look like? And at that time, they had a German CEO, and it turned out he was subscribing to a listserv we had called IP Health, and he had people actually paid to read and send him the best messages and things. And so he invited, at the board of directors approved, a meeting in Strasbourg, or near Strasbourg, France a couple of years ago, for Tim Hubbard, who worked in the Human Genome Project, and myself, to spend 3 days with 25 executives from Aventis. And the part of the exercise, they said to him, suppose you guys win and we lose, and you get everything you want. What does the world look like 20 years from now? That was the operating premise. And we had a promise coming in that we could look at completely no patent scenarios as part of the scenario. So we had a completely no patent scenarios. We had one called Radical IPR Scenario Number 1. And so this trade framework really came out of Radical IPR Scenario Number 1, which Aventis was supposed to publish. But I think the people that invite us in, the CEO left, and the people who invite us in were fired eventually. So I think that it was it was not an entirely successful collaboration. In fact, they begged me after a while. We used to call it Aventis Radical IPR Scenario 1, and they started begging me to take the Aventis brand off of the. For all, I had a disclaimer, which was that not endorsed by senior management of Aventis. And then when that guy called me up to say, a woman called me up to say she was looking for a job, but we decided, okay, we didn't realize it was that big of a problem, so we took it out. But anyway, that was sort of the origin of this, and there's been a lot of consultations. The most recent meeting was really about 10 days ago in Geneva. About 50 people were there, and it should have been 56. And why was it 50 instead of 56? Because 2 days before the meeting, the Director General of the WHO had to instruct every employee of the WHO, including the 3 that were personally representing him and the others from other departments, they were not permitted to attend our meeting because of pressure from the U.S. government. So this has now become a rather dangerous idea that even though it's got an increasingly large number of people participating in the exercise of the project, it's become a serious threat to the security of big pharma sector. So we're very proud of that. Okay, so here we go. Now, this is the current paradigm. This is Tim Hubbard, who's not an economist, but he's a scientist. This is a scientist version of a demand curve. You have your prices on the top, people treated there, and then you have like free, and then you have like the idea of generic drugs, and then you have to take care of R&D. And so that, because you have to get your fixed cost of R&D back, that's going to require you to raise prices. And then marketing, which empirically is a couple of times more than, it's 2 or 3 times more than R&D spending. And this doesn't get into profits it doesn't get into monopoly power, any of that other stuff. And as you can see, there's this thing. Now in economics, we like to call this part up here dead weight loss. This is sort of, the social cost supposedly of the, I think that's there's various aspects but in medical terms, you call these dead people. Okay, that's the other way it's referred to. And that's why this is such a serious problem, because unlike, say, the market for the new MP3 device or, lots of other goods, fashion sweaters or whatever like this, the consequence of screwing up here has a moral component to it as well as an economic component to it. Now, this is part of that story, very briefly. Now, fluconazole is a drug. Its primary market is to treat vaginal and toenail fungus. It's a very important drug. It's a very good antifungal drug. It has important uses for AIDS. One is AIDS-related thrush. I don't know if you've seen anyone that really has a serious case of thrush. There's a kid in a film that suffers from it. This film I gave Jamie called Dying for Drugs, a whole episode on a case like this. But the thing they were most worried about, I think, was the use in cryptococcal meningitis, which was affecting about 10% of AIDS patients back in 1998. Because if you're untreated, you get sick. It's brain fungus. It's a brain fungus disease. Is something that a fair amount of AIDS patients were getting. Now, blindness and death is the result of non-treatment. It's described as like an exploding head disease because it's incredibly painful, apparently. It's completely treatable with this drug. Pfizer did not have a patent in Thailand, but the U.S. government had forced Thailand to erect a barrier to introduction of generic drugs. So the price was in 1998 200 baht. I think it was about 40 baht to the dollar. So you had to take it every day. No one was getting treatment. Now, Thailand's a country with a good medical infrastructure, but the prices were just too high, and nobody was getting treatment. The NGOs had a campaign in 1998, demonstrations like this one. They got competition. The price fell in 9 months with generic competition to 6.5 baht. Everybody got treatment. So there it was. They introduced competition, prices fell, people got treatment, and they didn't die. That's what the result was. And this really energized the AIDS community. This was the first successful NGO campaign on this thing. Now, I showed this in Sri Lanka, and a woman came up and she asked me about the picture. She said she knew the guy. I asked him how he's doing, and she said, well, he's dead. He's an AIDS patient. So when we talk about the dead weight loss, he's one of the dead persons that represents in the dead weight loss. And he's a dead person because of U.S. government trade policy. It was a completely avoidable amount of suffering and death that kid went through. It's because U.S. government wanted to make sure that prices were high for Pfizer's products in that country. That's our trade policy. And it's deeply resented there and everywhere else. Now, this is a story, I think most people are familiar with these stories. This was the famous deadlier than the virus poster for, can we get a little darker light here? I mean, a little less light? Okay. He's the CEO of Glaxo. He didn't like this too well. I think people are kind of familiar with this story. This is a fairly recent demonstration in Korea over the price of leukemia drug. It's about $50,000 a year for this drug. The co-payment is so high. This is another drug that's featured in that film. The co-payment is so high on this drug that one of the guys that's featured in the film has actually sold his house, moved into a smaller thing to pay for it, and in the film he's actually stopped taking the drug, but he hasn't told he told his family that the drug no longer works. It's not true. The drug does work, but he's had such a financial hardship on his family that he just stopped taking the drug and he's going to die. Now, this is a drug fairly cheap to manufacture, and why there's a compulsory licensing case which failed here in Korea on this drug. Now, this is part of the backdrop for this. This is a letter from Don Evans, the Bush administration Secretary of Commerce, pointing out that Korea recently announced that they're going to modify their pharmaceutical pricing system. Could lead to a serious trade dispute, and they want basically to introduce a set of co-payments which give people incentives to use cheaper drugs, and that's apparently a disincentive for people to use the high-priced drugs that the American companies sell. The U.S. has considerable expertise and experience in healthcare financing matters. I don't know if you knew that or not. I mean, most Americans would be surprised to find that. And we look forward to the opportunity to work with you to find ways to buy high-quality health. I mean, we actually have an agreement with Korea that requires them to charge for innovative drugs the average of the German, the Swiss, the French, the UK, the United States, 7 countries, high-income countries' price for innovative drugs. So actually, the Gleevec price is actually more expensive in Korea than the United States because the formula just kind of, with currency changes, works out that way. Now, this is a story about a South Africa pricing of a drug for asthma. It's a drug my son takes, Singular. And the first chart is, we did this for a series of drugs. We took the U.S. price and we normalized the price as a dollar, as a one, not as a dollar, but as a unit of one. In other words, we took the price of Singular in the United States, and then we took the foreign price and divided by the U.S. price, but adjusted for relative per capita income. So from the point of view of the per capita income, the South Africa price looks to be nearly 7 times as high as the U.S. price, once you adjust for their per capita income. Now, this graph here is by income decile, and it shows that this drug would be 4% of the average income of people in the top decile in South Africa. That is the market for this product. They sell the product for the people in the top 10%. They do not sell it to the people down here, and the reason for that is that with 47% of the income in the top decile, it is the profit maximizing strategy is always to price your drugs in South Africa for the top 10% of the population. So when you have unequal income distribution within a country, you often observe pricing for elites. That's why in Indonesia, for example, the price of common antibiotics will be 3 times the Canadian price for some important antibiotics. And a lot of people are not familiar with this. So when people naively tell you, just give the companies unbridled power to price discriminate and everything will be fine, and the problem is they just don't have enough monopoly privileges and things like that. Be wary of those kind of arguments because they're not really based upon anybody actually looking at the data, or people that say that just don't know anything about what's going on out there, I'd have to say. Now, there's another issue about where does the money go when people spend on R&D. Now, UN agencies think they can routinely buy drugs for 1 to 5% of the European price with smart procurement and good negotiating. So we sort of say probably on average, we just picked a mid number, about 3% of the cost of a drug probably represents efficient manufacturing and distribution cost based on the UN experience for the family planning program. It's just kind of a rule. And it's certainly true of the AIDS drugs. You can now buy first-line regimes for AIDS drugs at around under $200 as opposed to well over 10,000 in the U.S. So that sort of fits that profile. Now you have so some of that would be like the manufacturing cost here, and then you'd have some R&D. This part right here on products which are not new, but they're still doing testing on them, like phase 4 trials and things. This is based on estimates from IRS data. And then about 8% of what you spend in the US is R&D on products which are new, but according to the FDA, not better than existing products. Now, how does that work? Well, about 7 out of 10 new drug approvals in the US in the last 10 years have been judged by the FDA to not offer any significant therapeutic benefits over existing treatments. And the clinical trials on the drugs that are not better are roughly twice as big as the clinical trials on the ones that are judged to be better. And there's a lot of reasons for that. If you have a product in a crowded therapeutic field, the FDA wants more evidence it's not going to hurt people because you already have products in the thing. And also, you're going to need to have bigger trials to find a rationale for taking your drug as opposed to another drug, like some small amount of difference, some small population that benefits better or something like that. So you have about 2 cents on the dollar right now empirically associated with R&D on products the FDA says are better. And of course, some of these guys maybe wanted to be the better drugs. Maybe they just weren't successful. But this is just a good way to kind of get your head around the numbers. And I don't have neglected diseases down because it's basically zero. I mean, the amount I spent on tuberculosis, malaria out of the private sector is basically trivial, despite the obvious need for it. Now, of course, there's marketing. Now, we have, in the United States, a good system of patient information. NASCAR race cars with, you can get the generic name there off the car. You notice that? That's done right. Don't want to promote the brand too much. And we talked to Aventis in our experiment about drug development, and we asked them how many people work for Aventis, and they said 76,000. So we said, well, how many of your employees work on research and development? They said about 7,000. So we said, well, what do the other 69,000 people do? And they said they sell the drugs. And so we're in this conversation with them, and they actually have a really big sales force. They know the names of the doctor's first wife, the doctor's second wife, their stepkids, the birthdays, everything, of every doctor on the planet, from Bangladesh to Zambar. I mean, they know. I mean, it's a very expensive, labor-intensive process to get doctors to prescribe drugs, and if that fails, to get patients to request doctors to prescribe drugs, and also to get people to write articles in journals that make it look like drugs are better than they are. And actually, the marketing is almost like a crime spree, if you know much about it. It's really not like a positive social good. It's often irrational prescribing, misleading information. It's not exactly a pretty sight. So there's like a lot of money going this end. So what we said to Big Pharma, we said, look at, you got 3 businesses the way we look at it. You guys that manufacture and distribute drugs. Let's just call that the generic drug industry. In our way of thinking, because when drug patents expire, that system seems to work pretty good all by itself. And then you have the part where you invent new drugs, and then you have the part where you give patient information, or to doctors and stuff. I said, we think we're not too worried about the part where you manufacture and distribute drugs because in the generic drug sector, there's never a problem when the patent expires. Really, it's anything significant. And we want to support the R&D thing as much as we can, because we think that's important. And I said, you must be good at R&D, because you're big pharma. So Aventis said, well, actually, all of our growth has come through acquisition. They say our internal pipeline really is not very good. So actually, we're not that good at innovation, but we acquire things. And it turns out there's this other sector, what we call little pharma, that does the innovation part. And then they hope to be bought by big pharma, because big pharma has the sales guys, but they have the ideas, and so if they come up with a promising idea, maybe a big pharma will buy your company and adopt you or something like that, license your technology, and then they go to their 69,000 salesmen, and then they basically make money. Can you imagine going head-to-head against Pfizer and Lipitor if you're a small company and you don't have sales force? It'd be difficult. And these companies are very good at it. They know the regulators, they know the insurance companies, they know the farm, they know all that. So they're very good at it. So that's basically, pharma is like very strong in the marketing thing. And the bigger they get, there's almost like a Peter principle on productivity and R&D. It seems like the worse they get in terms of productivity and innovation. So it's not like you need big pharma for innovation. You just need somebody to be like an investment banker for the little guys, kind of in a way. And that's what big pharma does. Big pharma basically feeds little pharma. They're the pot of gold at the end of the day. You get bought out by Pfizer or something. So we have this we don't like the current system because we think it's morally repugnant, economically inefficient, and corrupt, which is, so we don't like that part. So we want to fix things. So idea is we want to start out with the idea that we change the trade framework, not one just protecting the protection of property rights, but a new mechanism that ensures adequate global R&D investment. We don't really care about patents. What we care is what patents are supposed to induce, which is to say investment in innovation. So patents then in our model are a tool, not an end in themselves. So the point is not to have page after page about rules about patents in the trade agreement, but to have something kind of comprehensive about what is the obligation of a country to support R&D, and then recognizing a variety of different mechanisms to do that. And then the other thing is we're quite keen on, in terms of the implementation of the trade framework, is to encourage countries to separate the market for the product from the market for innovation. This to us is the key thing. We think it's essential. As long as you finance R&D from high prices on sick people, do not be shocked when people complain about the consequences of charging high prices on sick people. I mean, that's the point. That's what you're doing. And then when it happens, don't be so shocked all the time. That's what we're doing. I don't like it. You don't like it. Okay. So, we have to change this. Now, and I will start here with this promised religious story, because George Bush was just elected a couple of days ago, and apparently the evangelical Christians are running the country now. So I have my own evangelical Christian story, and then it goes like this, is that Jesus comes back to earth. It's sort of politically incorrect, but bear with me, okay? So Jesus comes back to earth, and he's looking around, and so people, well, what do you think? And he says, well, I'm not quite sure yet. I have to think a little bit about it, but I have this one question about the medicines. You've got all these interesting medicines that seem to relieve a lot of suffering and things, and we didn't have them when I was here. How do you organize this whole thing of developing new medicines? So he said, well, it's pretty simple. If somebody invents a new medicine, we give them a 20-year monopoly. They charge really high prices, and only the rich can afford it. But after 20 years, everyone gets access. So Jesus says, I'm a little uncomfortable about this 20-year period when only the rich get access to the drug. He says, is there another way to do this other than that system? So the story is, if there's no other way, you just have to put up with it. It's unfair, but without that, you don't get the innovation. But if you can figure out a different way to fund the innovation without that 20-year period of rationing and high drug prices, then you go to hell if you pick the wrong way. So you create the alternative. So we're trying so we're trying to invent a competing idea, so we're not stuck in the Sophie's choice about either innovation or access, because we don't like that choice. We want innovation and we want access. And we don't like the unfairness that's associated with the current system and a million of the other problems that are associated with it. So, with that introduction, some of the different proposals about marginal cost pricing of separating this market from the product from the market for the product from the market for innovation. This is the prize model system. And the George Soros story is like this, because George Soros actually hears about this, what's referred to as staff as the big idea in pharmaceuticals. So he wants to know, how does it work? Well, in fact, it's way too complicated to kind of boil it down. I'm going to get out of that meeting. But it comes down to this very simple conversation. He says, I don't understand, why would I invest in a product if I don't own the product at the end of the day? And I said, okay, you're George Soros. Pretend you're an investor. And so he's down with that. He's got that part down. So I said, okay, you asked to put $35 million into a clinical trial, and it's risky. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. And it takes a while. So, capital cost, et cetera. He says, okay, fine, he's with us. And I said, suppose if the product is a failure, you get nothing, which is the current system. But I said, suppose if it succeeds, the government writes you a check. I said, if the check is small, relative to the 35 million plus the risks and everything, you're not going to do it. He says, yeah, I'm not going to do it. But I said, with enough zeros, with a big enough prize, if the odds are kind of manageable, you will make that investment. You will take the plunge. And then all of a sudden he stops and he says, okay, I get it. He says, you've got to show how the prize system beats the price system. So that's his initial insight. And so what does it come to setting a prize on a drug which is different than a price? Well, it turns out not much difference. In Australia, they have a pharmacoeconomic analysis where they determine the reimbursement schedule on a drug. What's the difference between determining the reimbursement schedule and the price? Conceptually, not much difference. So most governments outside the United States actually go through this exercise where they assign reimbursement schedules to drugs based upon different criteria. One difference is, with the patent, you can refuse to register your product, which is the leverage. That's what the patent says. The patent says you can say you will not get Gleevec in England unless you meet our price, which is what Novartis did in every country that had leukemia patients. They hired lawyers and public relations guys for the leukemia payments, and they just let the government sweat it out. And then the government would delay the introduction of the new product. There's a lot of that takes place. Cancer drugs. Harder and harder to get cancer drugs prescribed off-label. It's basically, and that kind of thing with the patent system, it's really it's a game of bluffing. The government's pretending they're not going to insure the patients. Companies, pretending it's not going to drop the price. If it's a crappy drug, the company loses and the price comes down. If it's a really innovative drug that's important, the government loses. And nobody knows where it's going to go, because now you've got drugs that are coming to the market over $100,000 a year, and it's scary for the governments. I got a call from Canada. They asked me about some drug. I said, what should we do? I said, how much does it cost? I said, $20,000. I said, $20,000? That's a lot. He said, yeah. They said, $20,000 a month. That was the price. Now, what are you going to do? I mean, and the company gets $20,000 a month. Maybe next year they should ask for $40,000 a month. I mean, they have a legal obligation to pay in Canada. Why not just make it half the GDP? I mean, why stop at 20,000? So, I mean, there's this problem. And so, but the minute you are willing to say basically you're going to intervene in that market decision, setting it on price is not much different than a reimbursement schedule per se. So here's the U.S. proposal. U.S. investment, this is going to be introduced next year in Congress, and this will start a debate, a real debate. This will be a real bill. U.S. prize fund, 0.5% of GDP. An innovation fund. You register a product, it becomes an instant generic product. Anybody can manufacture it. But every time somebody uses the product, it generates data on the benefits to the patient, and that becomes part of your claim against the fund. And you compete in invidious competition with other people that registered products. And so if you're the only guy that has a product, you get all 57 billion. If there's two, you fight it out among each other, and you hire Wesley Cohen and people to argue why your drug's better than their drug. And basically, you go through this process. There's some transparent criteria, but then a lot of expert witnesses, and you basically shut it down after an alternative dispute resolution process, and then you go on. And you maybe generate claims of payoffs over a period of 5, 7, 10 years. We're still arguing about that because you don't know immediately how good the product is. But it's evidence-driven. So the idea is you put a product in the market. We don't care who sells the product. What we care is who benefits from the product. And if people benefit from the product, and you're the inventor, even if you're not the guy with the sales force, it doesn't make any difference. You get the prize, or the prizes, or the stream of revenue from it. So you essentially keep the patent system intact up to the point of registration. All the winner-take-all, send your kids to private schools, entrepreneurial gazas, all that sort of stuff we love about the current system. You got the whole, sort of rich man's game of biotech happening, completely intact. All the crazy patent thickets and all that stuff is totally intact. Anti-competitive area, not messing with that. We're keeping all that stuff we love. The only difference is when the product is registered, you don't get a monopoly. You get a stream of revenue based upon the benefits that the product generates. That's the only difference in this particular proposal. It's a very modest proposal. It doesn't change very much. It changes one thing. But that one thing changes a lot. Because it immediately ends rationing of medicines at the doctor level. Because every product then is cheap on the margin. And it immediately wipes out the NASCAR circuit cars and stuff like that. Because the people selling the products, they develop relationships, but their patient information is like it is in India. In India, Ranbaxy and Cipla, they sell the best asthma drugs there are, but they don't care who invented them. They sell them all. And so they don't bother to sell the crappy ones. And they compete against each other, but they're not going to spend half the GDP of some countries on marketing campaigns in the US. It just, but they have still actually pretty good patient information funds. Anyway, that's one story. The second one is the competitive intermediary story. This is the idea that you have employers required to give money to venture funds that do R&D. But they get to choose who they give the money to. And so you have these different funds which do drug development, and they compete with employers. And so I'm running an R&D fund, and I go to General Motors and I say, I see you have a lot of employees all kicking in $200 per employee into this innovation fund. And we want you to, just like, we want to be your pension fund. I used to be a pension fund consultant. That's where I sort of come from, this way of thinking. We want you to manage our R&D portfolio. But other than the pension fund, where you get a private rate of return, in the R&D fund, it could be a private rate of return, or it could just be, you have a lot of employees that have diabetes, and we have an effective strategy against diabetes. I don't think you're going to go and say, we have a good competitor to Viagra. I don't think that's really going to be your strategy. But you're going to have, you're going to basically, the idea is you force employers to invest in R&D, but they get to pick the companies that they think. And that way, it's not a centralized model. It's not the Soviet Union style model. It's really completely decentralized and competitive. And that's a competitive intermediary story. And they can adopt different strategies. They could adopt prize models, open source, a variety of different things. And you have government regulating the transparency. Now, what we want to do in the treaty framework is actually not to force people to the prize system or the patent system or the government-funded system like energy, but actually to give people the freedom to pick all kinds of other things, and in fact to experiment with different business models dynamically, learn from each other, and continue to evolve the most effective business models. And not to force the French to do it the same way as the Germans, and us the same way as the Mexicans. We'll allow people to basically appeal to our own institutional and cultural strengths in different things. So we create obligations and incentive to invest in priority research and public goods. And we recognize there's all kinds of different ways that you might want to think about financing research. Like if you buy products, every dollar gets about 13 cents invested in R&D in the U.S. market, based on evidence. You can do the prize fund. You can buy out the IP at the voluntary or non-voluntary. Direct research, tax credits, open collaborative projects, invest in other countries, give money to the WHO. All of those things essentially represent different ways that you can fund R&D. And there's more, I'm sure. So, and there's also different ways you can think about the things. Like you can have patents, you can have prizes, you can have patents with prizes, patents without prizes, vice versa. You can have entrepreneurial research, open collaborative, directed research. There's you can slice and dice it a million different ways. It isn't really a particular thing that you have to follow. We're trying to, and this is the hardest thing we have to sell because we're identified with open source, anti-patent, in the literature by some people. But we're not saying that. We're saying is that there's a lot of different combinations you might want to think about. And as I mentioned earlier, what Jamie said is that for some kinds of problems, you will find that some strategies are probably working better than others are. You don't want to probably force people into eliminating this system for everything. Or maybe some products you think this is the best way to go. Other products may fit better. The Human Genome Project is more this kind of a deal. The prizes is being used a lot now in the BioShield thing for development of bio things, but in connection actually with some directed research and some tax credits. And so you can sort of think of a lot of different ways of doing these things. The other thing is priority setting is really a mess right now. Under the TRIPS agreement and all the extensions of that and the bilaterals and everything, basically it's all about investing in products and get high prices. And they can be a Me Too product that's about the same as an existing product, or they can be but they're not going to be public goods like the Human Genome Project. It's not going to be basic research. It's not going to be products for the poor. So it leaves a lot out. So one of the ideas we want to have is that, A, we're going to count both public and private sector research. And then B, we want to have minimum quotas for investment in priority research, and a system of credits, of flexible credits for other things. And I'll come back to this because it's quite important for the agreement. So the treaty mechanism of your country, you have these different choices. You can invest like here. You can do the prize fund. And these are the way you think about things. And then you report what you do to the treaty secretariat, who's then governed by this infrastructure of member countries. And then we also have these committees that deal with different other things that are part of the treaty, because it's what we call the big treaty, and so it's got a lot of stuff in it. And so we have incentives and best practices on open access publishing. We have issues on accountings. We have and a whole system of credits I'll describe in a second here. So the basic obligation is a fraction of GDP finances R&D. High income, middle, and low income. And we just have different things. This is the qualified medical R&D, the QMRD, which is what's used in the treaty language right now. The initial proposal was high-income countries, 15 basis points of GDP, 10 points for high middle income, 5 basis points for low middle income, and 0 for the lowest countries. Now, some people criticize this because they want the same rate for every country, because they don't really think that you have to do, they don't think it's necessary to do anything really extra low for low-income countries, because empirically, the Philippines could, has a higher fraction of their GDP than most European countries right now going to drug purchase, for example. And they also think it's not helping low-income countries to underinvest in knowledge-based industries. But other people are very strong for the graduated thing, and this is just kind of the current state of play. There's another alternative that's a little bit more graduated. It's more like an income tax, but it's different than a tax. Now, the methods of finance, what would qualify? Well, public sector expenditures, tax expenditures, philanthropic money, because your domestic situation gives incentives for people to give money, and that's important, like what Gates does. You have research mandates. We've talked a little bit about that, but there's a lot of examples in countries that do that sort of thing, including the U.S. Then we have expenditures on relevant medical products to the degree that the expenditures create incentives to invest in R&D. That's the idea that if you buy drugs, and statistically about 13% of that's reinvested in R&D, by just buying medicine, you get credit for funding R&D, even though you're buying it from a foreign government, a company. Like you could be in Mexico buying drugs from Pfizer, and every time you spend $1, you get credit for 13 cents of funding R&D, because Pfizer's reinvest, not just Pfizer, but the sector Pfizer's in statistically kind of does that. And the other one is that if you have innovation prizes instead of the drug purchases, it's the same rule. It's to the degree that the innovation prize drives investment, is effective in driving investment. So basically, you have this kind of thing, and you have some measurement rules, which is no double counting, sources of finance rather than location of investment, which is to say, if you buy the drug in Kenya, but the drugs are made in India or made in the United States, what we care about is who's buying the drugs and whether those purchases ultimately fund R&D somewhere in the planet. We don't care if the R&D is performed in the Philippines, in Thailand, Germany, or the United States. What we care about is who's footing the bill. So in this way of thinking about it, it's a consumer purchase. It's where the consumers live, not where the sellers live, that count in terms of that sort of thing. And then evidence-based evidence. We want estimates. In other words, like if you're looking at how much you induce investment in R&D, it has to be driven by real data. And there's things on that too. Now, the credits. This, I think, is the newest part of the thing. Is this whole idea, we used to have weights to drive investment into malaria and things like that. But we said, let's call them credits, because corporations are used to credits. And everybody fills out tax returns. There's a credit for the orphan drug investments, a credit for R&D, there's credit for all sorts of things. So we call them credits. It sounds more positive than a weight. A weight's like, credit's good, so we're like very thinking about the words now. So, and so these are some of the initial idea of credits. So if you invest in some of these things, in addition to getting credit for what the investment is, you get a bonus. You get a credit on top of it, up to some caps. And so if you want technology transfer to developed countries to happen, and what they do in Europe is you get framework money if you collaborate with somebody in the south from the north. So if you're in Sweden or England and you have to pick up a southern partner to get a grant, Initially, everybody hated that in Europe. They thought it was complete bullshit, and they were working with bozos and things like that. Then after a while, they discovered there was actually intelligent people in the south of Europe, and they began to actually develop some good networks. And technology transfer began to actually happen and begin to help make Europe into Europe as opposed to a bunch of separate countries. So the idea is that people do collaborative north-south collaborations. If Duke did a collaboration with a Kenyan university, that would not only count for the amount that you spent, but you get a bonus for the fact that you're collaborating with a southern partner and they're picking up some technology. Same thing on preservation, dissemination of technology, actually created an economic incentive for countries and meeting their obligations under the thing to actually to disseminate information about traditional knowledge and preserve it. This is actually not an IP framework, which is being pushed by WIPO, but this is more of a public domain framework, but it's actually creating. We're creating, through these things, we're writing our own script here. We're creating, now what is the currency? What is the central bank of this thing? The central bank is a maximum obligation, the minimum obligation you have. So if you have 15 basis points, or 16 basis points, or 20 basis points, that's the central bank decision. That's what you have to fill up somehow. And you fill it up either with actual expenditures or expenditures such that they generate the credits. And it's designed to be tradable, so if you don't meet your expenditures, you get to buy some credits from somebody else. So if France has an excess of credits, they can sell up to a cap their credits to another country that doesn't really want to invest in research in their own way. And essentially what it does is it means even if you're maxed out on your minimum, you still may want to do extra research on malaria or something like that because it gets created a credit at a certain point. It actually creates an incentive to sort of chase these public goods. So we're creating through the credit system and the maximum our own currency for public goods. I want you to think about this because what do we have? We have way too much investment in crappy consumer goods because the price system is really kick-ass efficient at driving investment in things people will pay for. So we have closets full of shit we have to put in garage sales and get rid of all the time because we just acquire so much stuff. The market mechanism is awesomely effective in getting us to part with our hard-earned cash for crap that we don't even really want the day after we buy it. But we all know there's a lot of public goods that should be created and could be done, but we don't really have those kind of effective mechanisms to create those kind of public goods. So we're trying to introduce in here the idea that we can correct some of that. Okay, that's part of, I just want you to understand it because it's a little new. And it's we were sort of driven to this by this economist from the Council of Economic Advisor for Bush. Believe it or not, he sort of liked moving us in this direction. And we thought about it, we agreed. That's one of my last slide here. But so what we're working on, and I'll show you a little spreadsheet here, but then I'll take some questions, which is how the numbers work out for countries in different countries, and you can sort of see in the initial idea how this sort of thing would work. I apologize for not having this ready to go right now, but a little slow here. So let me give you the transition idea, because you might think this is just like a typical crazy idea that's never going to go anywhere. And of course, it's possible that nothing will ever happen to this, but I wouldn't be working on it if I didn't really think that we could pull this off. And I want to explain to you how I think we can do it, because I think that there's a bit of a credibility issue here for us, and that is that it's such a radical change. How do you actually undo the current trade framework and create this kind of new way of thinking about funding innovation, and so fundamentally change the idea of the separation of the market for the product from the market for innovation, and sort of encourage this kind of thinking? Well, one way you do is you live in a country that's now hitting about $1,000 per capita on outlays for drugs when you add up all the categories, including hospital purchases and things like that, and VA purchases. It's really unbelievable how much the U.S. is approaching about $280 billion right now in expenditure outlays on medicine. It's going up every year quite a bit. And you have a situation where the rollout prices on really innovative drugs is just really, really aggressive and pushing people to the wall. And you have a lot of sort of crisis of the unfairness. You also have like a situation where members of Congress happen to know people that can't afford drugs in this country, and they know a lot of horror stories and hardships and stuff. So even like these conservative Republicans, like Dan Burton, impeachment manager for Clinton, is on the warpath against Big Pharma. You now have 70 members of the U.S. Senate, including a lot of Republicans, that are now supporting parallel trade between Canada and the United States, even though it's in order of first importance of pharma, because it's essentially the introduction of significantly lower price tiers in the United States on the biggest market in the world. There's nothing bigger to them than preserving the U.S. market as we know it, which is an unfettered free market. But the minute they begin to introduce any kind of reference pricing, directly or indirectly, or parallel trade, and it's going to Europe too, the bills all have Europe in the mix, it would really going to cost a lot of money to Big Pharma. And Big Pharma can't win that battle. They can't win. And that's a crappy, lousy, limited imagination proposal too. But it's still radically opposed to that. Now the other thing is that, like, if we were to sort of sit down and work with people at the grassroots on some little marginal change in the orphan drug credit, which is a complete ripoff the way it's being managed, and exclusivity, and the Waxman-Hatch extensions, and a million other kinds of small reforms, I swear to God, I couldn't get 13 letters to the U.S. Congress on something like that, and any member to I mean, and even if they raise it, it's not much going to happen about it. They're just really too complicated, too marginal. The benefits are too small. But if we go out and we talk to, as we're talking to, we say, look, if we win on this thing, if we're right about this, and we could be wrong. Right now, we just want to debate. We're just saying engage and evaluate, because we're not suggesting that they change tomorrow. What we want to do is we want to actually have a debate on this. Because I said, if we're right about this, that means you can end rationing of medicine in the United States, and everybody would get access to cheap drugs. That's the upside. In fact, people will get access to cheap drugs for the next 100 years from the United States to Zimbabwe and everywhere in between. It would be big. It would be more important than anything anyone has done like this. It would really be important, okay? And sometimes when you raise the stakes, it's easier than when the stakes are small, because you can mobilize people. You can actually build a social movement. You can actually make people pay attention. You can get them to engage on the issue, and that's what we're trying to do. So thank you for having me here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie, for that fabulous presentation. By the way, the article which Jamie wrote with Tim Hubbard is going to be available, which it lays out some of the basis for this, is going to be available outside. You can pick it up. We have time for about 10 or 15 minutes of questions. Jamie, I'll let you handle them yourself. And then after that, we hope you'll join us for a reception here.
Yes, in the black shirt in the back, and then I'll work forward and then gray shirt second.
I enjoyed your talk, and in general, I like the idea of a prize. And I like the idea of hiring Wes Cohen to help sort things out if a couple products reach the market. Just a couple of and I think a prize is a good idea, just a couple logistical questions. One related to the Wes Cohen dilemma. If a product...
You've been nationalized.
if a product reaches the market and it fulfills the criteria and receives the prize, although there's another product a couple years away that might be even better, and then... There's another product 4 years.
Right. This is the Kramer purchase fund problem. Yeah. Right.
And then curious about that, and also the credibility. And you're right. This is very much related to Michael Kramer's work also. So then the second part being the credibility. So government promises, here's a pot of money. Then 5 years later says, boy, our budget's tight. Let's make that pot a little bit smaller.
That's right. So in the One of the transition mechanisms in this proposal is the idea that the initial treaty framework is pretty light. What it says is that everyone who signs the treaty agrees not to bring dispute resolution against everyone else that signed the treaty, as long as everyone's up to their numbers on any bilateral involving IPR or price issues. So the benefit of joining the treaty is that you get to do what you want, irrespective of the bilaterals and things like that. You get everybody off your back. And I think the implication is you do not get people off your back at all if you don't sign it. I mean, people are signing agreements they don't want to do. So for outside the U.S., clearly countries are being forced through trade pressure. I mean, there's a big thing between the EU right now and Turkey on reimbursement schedules going on, and we'll see how that plays out. But I think there's already quite a bit of coercion in the international arena. The question is for the U.S. market, which is, I think, the most important one. The U.S. wouldn't be bound by this at all, because the U.S. is already way beyond any of the norms we could possibly set in the treaty. We're already doing about 50 basis points of support to GDP between public and private sector in the U.S., about 3 times what most countries would, in the best days, probably be doing. So the U.S. is kind of like an outlier. So there's nothing in here particularly binding. Now, if the U.S. was to do a prize fund, the initial model, first of all, on the prize fund is different quite a bit than Kramer. Kramer has this idea, very much almost like military procurement, that you specify what you want and the prize is associated with that. That's the way the longitude prize was. The longitude prize, we want this, it has to be a certain amount of accuracy, blah, 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 and then we pay for it, right? This prize fund, it can be designed different ways, and there's going to be a meeting probably at Columbia that Joe Stiglitz is going to host on the design of the prize fund next spring. And anybody wants to participate, let me know, and we'll invite you. But the idea is the initial thinking is that you set up a process where the things that's specified are quite general, like quality-adjusted day lives and things like that, as opposed to sort of very specific products and diseases. So the prizes is sort of a general criteria that any product that's worth anything is going to be able to qualify as having generated some benefits. And the other role would be incremental improvements over existing products. And so going in that there's an existing product and yours is no better than the existing product, your payoff is very small. But that's actually the correct economic signal. You know that if you have a bigger incremental improvement, it could be a big market drug, and even a small change could be worth a lot of money to society. And maybe the mechanisms are well enough known that it's fairly easy to engineer a fairly small change, but it may have, because of usage, a value. So that's actually, I think, the fairly easy thing. Now, if you look at Australia, what Australia used to do is they used to have a fixed budget for pharma, and then they used to assign reimbursement schedules for different drugs. And the way the old Australian system worked was that every time they increased the outlays on one drug, they had to decrease it for another drug. It was a zero-sum game. And that's what got us thinking about the zero-sum nature of the thing. Every drug in the Australian system was essentially competing against alternative ways you could spend your money. You had $1 billion, you were buying outputs of healthcare with that $1 billion. And so every time Pfizer was saying, buy our drug, you're saying, well, okay, what do we get in terms of pharmacoeconomic outputs from buying your drug compared to what we got, and how much are you going to charge us for those outputs? And so that's kind of, the Australian experience was sort of informative for us. But the other thing we were thinking about, which is a harder problem, it has to do with the scaling of the prizes, because in the U.S., some drugs, in fact, most drugs are registered for relatively small diseases. And most of the money goes for a handful of drugs for blockbusters, the whole blockbuster problem. Now, like Lipitor generates about $8 billion a year or something like that. Now, there's no way that you really can map $8 billion a year in anyone's sort of. So the question is, do you sort of truncate on the upside and shove more of the money into the lower end? There's kind of a logarithmic kind of issue that's going on here. So we're trying to model that a little bit and think through those problems, because as you know, discovery is a bit of a stochastic, there's a lot of serendipity process. And I think what you have to do is have kind of a rough expectations that if you're successful, on average, you're going to basically get something out of your product. And I think by skewing the awards with the sort of equivalent of the Britney effect in music, but toward drugs, where you get half the gross national product of the southern hemisphere for one ulcer drug, but very small amounts for another drug, that may not be the most efficient way to induce investment in innovation. You may be better off knocking a little off the top, but that's actually a more difficult problem. And just basically modeling pharmacoeconomic outputs, I think, is fairly simple. And I'm sorry for the very long answer. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, because advertising drives up costs, why not just short circuit this whole thing and limit the advertising that pharma companies can do, as we had done previous, I believe it was like 5 or 6 years ago, this explosion of advertising has happened. I mean, everything, like you said, from NASCAR to commercials, just TV to pens, it's everywhere.
Yeah, and I think actually, from a dollar point of view, the direct-to-consumer advertising is small relative to what they do with the doctors, but it's a visible thing that's in your face, and I think that it's actually changing the way people think about pharma companies. They're beginning to think of them as people that sell consumer products, because they're advertised in the same media, the ads look the same and stuff like that. I think it's sort of diminished the reputation of the big companies as big scientific outfits more. I think it looks more like what it is. Now, only a couple countries in the world have direct-to-the-consumer advertising. I think New Zealand and us may be the only countries I can think of. But it's illegal in most parts of the world. But I still think there's so much money. If you have a product that you have a monopoly on, the incentives are so big, the amount of massive outlays on marketing are amazing. And there's even a cottage industry in how you get your marketing people into the clinical trial phase, to design your clinical trial staff marketing benefits. if you go on the web and you look at marketing R&D, you find there's like all kinds of boutique consulting firms and special conferences, and it's quite a and advising people to bring the guys in early. And a lot of the cost of the clinical trials is pumped up by a lot of marketing kind of consideration. It's kind of a cancer, I guess, in a way, the drug development fields. I think what we're trying to do is change the incentives, so it's just not really as interesting for people to do that. Yeah.
Couple of questions on a detail of the prize scheme and how the prizes would be allocated, say, on the basis of use, which is a great thing. Presumably you have marginal cost pricing there, one, right? But doesn't, I might be confused, but doesn't that set up, per your remarks just now, a very strong incentive actually for promotion and a detail man in the armies? Because if your share of that prize, right, depends on how much gets used, i.e. sold out there, you haven't really obviated under that scheme the marketing incentive. Then I have a second question, unrelated. The point that David Ridley just raised, which is, what do you do about the notion, well, with a modest improvement, you might blow out the pioneer product in the category, and what does that do to the incentives to come up with the pioneer a drug in the category to begin with, if there's that prospect? Could this be worked with a variant on some sort of licensing scheme such that the pioneer, per current practice, would actually be able to realize some of the returns from improvement drugs? So those are two completely separate questions. But the marketing question first.
Yeah, I think the follow-on invention is really an important thing, particularly as it relates to the first product, which is you're pointing out. And the current system is such that the first product often is replaced by later entrants completely. And so the current system would be that a latecomer can essentially not only share us, but can actually wipe out the revenues of the initial product. And in a lot of categories of drugs, like on AIDS drugs, non-nucleoside, it's the second one in the class, which was the best in the class. It has 80% of the market. So, yeah, right. So, of course, the first product is generating fairly significant incremental benefits because there maybe was nothing in the class. So that's actually a fairly high way of valuing. The question is, in designing it, would you want to have kind of a residual claim on the people that come in your footsteps and say, yeah, just say, wait a second, that looks a lot like my product, like that's kind of my product plus. So let's get honest. I'm actually 80% of your product, and I think that's one of. I think you put your finger. That's one of the things that people are trying to figure out how to model those kind of problems. Now, let's get back to the first one. The first one's on marketing. If the more people that use your product, wouldn't you want to go around and like maintain a workforce? Well, the problem is that the reason why you get what you get out of Pfizer and these big companies. So not that many companies can really do this big marketing operation. It's a very small number of people to maintain that kind of fixed cost thing. It's because the marketing, the patient information is linked very closely to the manufacturing sales, and they know that it's an unknown question. Would that replicate itself completely under the prize system? In other words, it would be exactly like what we see today. Would you see the same ads, the same workforces and stuff? Our intuition is it would kind of destroy the current system. And in its place, you'd see people working the journals and working around the margin. Some things, some promotional efforts, but we just do not see 35% of a big pharma company, which is what you're seeing right now. In some cases, 40%. In these kind of outlays, we just don't see the economic model that would really. Because here's the thing. Let me just put it this way. Right now, if I invent a drug and I put it on the market, if I don't sell it, or license to somebody to sell it, that's the end of the road for me. But if just by having the product in the market, if it's used and it's sold by anybody, including generic drug, if they're actually doing that for you, maybe you hire Pfizer to hype your product. Maybe you don't. I don't know. My guess is that if the reward system are right, one reason you have less marketing is because you don't get rewarded for non-innovative products. And the more the payoff is linked to true innovation, in other words, you need more marketing the crappier your product is. The more your product actually is no different than the existing therapies, the more you really have to market it.
But that's
Yeah.
the trouble, say clarity, which is
Yeah.
almost worthless, right?
What's that?
Clarity, for example, which
Yeah.
is really not
Right.
effective at all. People are running around thinking, "Oh, I need this."
But
right? They're persuaded. It's not because
Yeah. So the idea is that the idea one of the features of the prize system is to link the rewards to incremental therapeutic improvements, not only usage. So you could basically have a huge amount of usage, but if it's considered to be basically not improving things very much, then
So tie the prize not just to usage, but to some incremental, scientifically established
Incremental therapy
performance improvement.
Yeah, the idea, you put the drug in the market, how much better off are people than they were before the product was the market? If the answer is they're using your brand instead of that other brand, that's not really providing many health benefits. If in fact 10% of the people are actually a little better off in your thing, or then you have kind of more of an argument. But I think that will probably drive changes in the marketing outlays more than anything else, probably. Yeah.
While the current detailing practices of pharmaceutical companies have been heavily criticized in this forum, I'm just curious, one of the arguments that they provide for that's not entirely something that you'd want to do away with is that they contribute to medical education in some ways, where
yeah.
they sort of reach out to physicians that have been in the field for quite a while and may or may not be abreast of newest development. So, I mean, while there may be a sort of a corruption of that practice of detailing and selling things that may not need to be sold, etc., there is an element of medical education that takes place via these colossal sales forces. And so where in this plan does that fit?
Yeah, and that's what Aventis said. They said, believe it or not everything we do is crap in the marketing stage. That was actually the way they said it, And they said doctors don't learn anything after medical school, and it's really they rely upon us for information. Now, in India, how does it work in India? Well, in India, the generic companies like Ranbaxy and supplement companies like that, they actually provide pretty good patient information. It's just not their products; it's somebody else's products, but it's just a service they provide. It's one of the ways they build up goodwill within the medical community. And looking at the packet inserts and some of the literature, promotional literature on AIDS and asthma I've seen from India, I'd have to say it looked like it was pretty useful stuff to me anyhow in reading it. So, but people have identified this as an issue, which is you throw the baby out with the bath. You go too far in undermining the marketing process. Is it actually is there something there? I mean we really believe that is really the biggest inefficiency in the system, based on the numbers. Yeah.
Where it's invented to where it's actually being used in the field, and so that connection is what I'm kind of like.
That's right. And I've heard people say that if you don't have some kind of a marketing thing, you will not get rollout of new products. I think it depends on the product. You take a product like Gleevec that Richard Rockefeller takes, you die without it. It sort of sells itself. You take a product which is a little bit better anti-infectant, maybe, but maybe the medical profession has really, in a way, made a bad choice in just deferring so much of these decisions to people that have so many conflicts of interest and are sucking up so much of the dollar. I mean, I know in Canada, in some countries now, in the UK, pharmaceuticals are now more than half of outpatient services for the National Health Service in the UK, and it's more than physician services in Canada now. So I mean, it's not like a small part of the budget like in the old days, and so it's chewing up a lot of the budget, and there's a lot of scandals about the kind of information you're getting. So it may be that the equilibrium would not be no information, but maybe the profession would have to sort of heal itself in that respect a little bit.
Take one more, Kevin, and then finish.
I can't help but respond to that. I mean, I don't think we need pharmaceutical companies to educate doctors. If they don't want to read after they get done with medical school, we don't need to pay them. So that's not a big deal. you talked about medical research, and most of your proposal is focusing on the economics of small molecules, but that's an increasingly less important part of the marketplace compared to proteins where the cost of production could be 50%, or compared to medical devices like our new ICDs that we're going to put half the GDP into. And so as you're thinking about the scheme, is this small molecule R&D or is this across the board into R&D investment?
Well, we thought about an expensive to manufacture product, like Ceridase is an example of it's an expensive biotech product that, manufacturing costs are really huge. People complain about the cost of manufacturing T20 and things, although we've had offers for T20 manufacturing about a third of the U.S. price, but nonetheless, they're not trivial. I think that once you sort of change the way you think about the financing R&D thing, it allows society to make more intelligent decisions on procurement of expensive to manufacture products. I mean, and we haven't decided how far to extend this to devices, because our thinking, even though we call it the big treaty, I'm cautioning people, don't try and do too much under the first instrument. It's a big innovation as it is. I said, let's try and limit it initially just to prescription medicines, vaccines and medicines, and not really go into devices at this point, because we have a lot to prove in this other area. Let's not try and do everything all at once. And so we're trying to stay away from devices at this point. But as far as expensive to manufacture biologics and things like that, I think that the model for procurement could be quite different if you weren't worried about the sort of sole sourcing issue. I mean, governments could essentially do competitive bidding to have efficient manufacturing in a much more competitive environment if they didn't have to worry about the IPR on the product. And so once you separate the product from the reward for the innovation, you can move to a competitive environment in manufacturing. Now, it's true that you'll have a lot of trade secret problems, know-how problems in some areas, but I think we're trying to create an environment where you're really in a position to push fewer trade secrets and more openness at every end of the system.
Yeah, I mean, for that one, so the regulatory scheme for a biologic, per se, is approval of the concept, but it's also approval of the manufacturing process.
Right. Yeah.
So if I don't make it the way Amgen makes it, I'm not making erythropoietin.
Right, but the reason the U.S. is over a barrel with an Amgen product is typically Amgen's the only person that can legally sell it, and your ability to negotiate with someone who has monopoly is a lot different. The ability to go out in the open market and say, okay, I just think that's a bit pricey, and we'd like you to come down the price, and if you won't come down the price, even though we'll buy it from you, we're going to find somebody that'll do. You can figure out how to do it at a different price. I mean, I think you're in a position to negotiate better. That's what we're thinking. I don't think you can do worse. The Amgen is incredibly aggressive on its pricing, as you know.
Okay, I think we'll call it quits, and hope you'll join us at the reception. Let's thank Jamie Love. Just one note, for those of you who are around the law school, tomorrow Jamie's going to be talking at lunchtime about careers in public interest, particularly public interest focusing on the IP issues. So please join us for that tomorrow, I think it's